The house was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels calm or restful. This was different. This was the kind of silence that feels wrong even before you understand why. The blinds were drawn. The air inside felt still, almost untouched. Nothing moved. No television. No footsteps. No voice. Just stillness. Days had passed since anyone had heard from him. At first, no one thought much of it. People get busy. They miss calls. They forget to reply. But this was Travis. And Travis didn't just disappear. He had plans, a trip coming up, commitments, a routine. And slowly, the silence started to feel heavier. Friends tried calling. No answer. They sent messages. Nothing. The concern built gradually, then all at once. Something wasn't right, so they decided to check on him. When they arrived at the house, everything looked normal. Too normal. The outside gave nothing away. No broken windows. No forced entry. No signs of disturbance. Just a quiet home, sitting still under the sun. They knocked, waited, knocked again. Still nothing. And that was the moment it shifted from concern to fear. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, unsettling. The kind of feeling you can't explain, but you can't ignore either. They moved carefully through the house, each step slower than the last, calling his name, hoping for an answer, expecting one, but none came. The living room was untouched, everything in place. No signs of struggle, no signs of panic, just silence. Then they reached the hallway, and something changed. Not something visible, something felt, a shift in the atmosphere, a tension that wasn't there before. They kept moving toward the bathroom. The door was partially open, just enough to see inside, and then everything stopped. Because what they saw in that room was something they would never forget. He was on the floor, still unmoving. The position unnatural, the scene confusing. At first, it didn't make sense. Your mind tries to process it, to explain it, to find a logical reason, but nothing fits. Because this wasn't something simple. This wasn't something you could explain away. The room told a different story, a story that didn't match the calm of the rest of the house. And that contrast made it worse, because everything else looked normal. But this was not. The police were called, and when they arrived, they saw what the others had seen. But they saw something else too. Details, patterns, things most people would miss. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence of a break-in, no clear indication of robbery, nothing missing, nothing overturned, nothing that suggested chaos from the outside, which led to one quiet, uncomfortable thought. Whoever did this had been allowed inside, or had already been there, and that changed everything. Because now, this wasn't just a crime, it was personal. And somewhere inside that house were answers, hidden. Before the investigation, before the headlines, before the courtroom, there was a version of her that looked completely different. A version people trusted, a version that didn't raise suspicion. Jodi Arias. If you had met her casually, you wouldn't have remembered anything unusual. She wasn't loud, she wasn't aggressive, she didn't demand attention. She blended in, and sometimes that's what makes a person harder to read. She spoke softly. Her tone was measured, controlled. She smiled easily, but not excessively, just enough to seem warm, approachable, normal. That word, normal, would come up again and again, because nothing about her on the surface suggested danger. She had interests, creative ones. Photography, art. She saw the world through a lens, literally, capturing moments, framing them, choosing what to show and what to leave out. And in a way, that detail would become more important than anyone realized. Because perspective matters. What you show, what you hide, what you focus on, and what you don't. People who knew her described her as quiet, reserved, someone who didn't cause problems, someone who stayed in her lane. There were no obvious warning signs, no sudden outbursts, no history that immediately stood out. And that's what made everything that followed so difficult to understand. Because when people hear about a crime like this, they expect something obvious. They expect anger, instability, a clear signal that something was wrong. But here, there was none of that, at least not in the beginning. And that's what created the first layer of confusion. Because if nothing about her stood out, then where did it come from? Was it always there, just hidden? Or did something change? Something that shifted everything quietly over time? Because the truth is, not all dangerous situations begin with obvious signs. Some begin slowly, subtly, so quietly that by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. And that's what made this story different, because the version of her people thought they knew, and the version that investigators would later uncover did not match, not even close. And that gap between perception and reality would become one of the most important parts of the entire case. Every story like this has a beginning that feels ordinary, a moment that at the time means nothing. Just two people meeting, talking, connecting. For Jodi and Travis, that moment came at a conference, a place filled with energy, people moving, conversations overlapping, ambition in the air. It wasn't the kind of place where you expect something important to happen. But sometimes, the most significant connections start in the most casual ways. They met, they talked, and something clicked. Not instantly overwhelming, not dramatic, just easy, natural, the kind of conversation that flows without effort. And that's how it began. Travis Alexander was the kind of person people noticed. Confident, focused, driven. He had goals, structure, a direction for his life that felt clear and intentional. He wasn't just moving forward, he knew where he was going. And for someone like Jodi, that kind of presence can be powerful, grounding, attractive. He represented stability, purpose, something solid, and she leaned into that. Their connection grew quickly. Calls turned into longer conversations. Messages became more frequent. Distance didn't slow things down. If anything, it intensified them. Because when something feels right at the beginning, you don't question it, you move forward. They became involved, and at first, everything looked like progress, growth, connection. But beneath the surface, there were small shifts, subtle ones, the kind you don't notice immediately. Jodi didn't just enter Travis's life, she adjusted herself to fit into it. His beliefs, his routines, his world. She converted to his religion, committed fully, not partially, not casually, fully. And on the surface, that looks like dedication, commitment, effort. But when you step back, you start to see something else, a level of adaptation that goes beyond connection, into identity. Because there's a difference between sharing a life with someone and reshaping yourself entirely around them. And that line is easy to miss at the beginning. Travis saw something in her, someone who cared, someone who was willing to grow. But relationships aren't built in one direction. They require balance. And slowly, that balance began to shift. The more she moved toward him, the more space he began to create. Not immediately, not obviously, just small changes, less availability, more distance. And those changes, even when they're small, can feel significant to the person on the other side. Because when one person moves closer and the other pulls away, the space between them doesn't stay neutral. It stretches. It builds tension. And that tension doesn't disappear. It grows. At first, it didn't look like a problem, just normal relationship dynamics. Ups and downs, moments of closeness, moments of distance. That's how most people would describe it. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, but if you looked closer, you could see the pattern forming. It wasn't balanced. It wasn't stable. It moved between extremes, connection, then separation, emotion, then withdrawal. And over time, that kind of pattern starts to take a toll because it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty changes how people behave. Travis began to step back, gradually, not in a single moment, but in a series of small decisions. Less communication, more independence. A shift in focus. He was moving forward, but not in the same direction as before. And Jodi felt that, even if it wasn't said out loud. It was clear. The connection was changing, and instead of pulling back, she moved closer. More messages, more calls, more effort to maintain what was slipping away. Because when something feels like it's leaving, the instinct isn't always to let it go. Sometimes the instinct is to hold on tighter, to try harder, to fix what isn't working. But the harder one person tries, the more pressure it creates. And pressure rarely brings people closer. It pushes them apart. The relationship became unpredictable, not just in what happened, but in how it felt. One moment, everything seemed normal. The next, something was off. Unspoken tension, unresolved issues, things left hanging in the air. And that kind of environment changes people. It creates emotional imbalance. One person trying to move forward, the other trying to hold on. And that imbalance doesn't stay contained. It grows. In those final days, Travis was preparing for a trip. He had commitments, people expecting him, a schedule to follow. He was moving forward, focused on what came next. And that's important. He was engaged with his life, looking ahead. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Jodi was moving too, traveling, driving, covering distance. Her movements at first didn't stand out. People travel all the time. It's not unusual. But later, when investigators began mapping everything out, her movements became one of the most important parts of the timeline. Because timelines don't lie. People can change their stories. They can forget details. They can adjust what they say. But movement leaves a trail. Gas stations, receipts, mileage, phone signals. Every step creates a record. And those records don't change. At some point during those days, their paths crossed again. Inside that house, the same house that would later fall silent, the same house where everything would end. But at that time, there was no visible conflict, no clear sign that anything was about to happen. And that's what makes moments like this so difficult to understand. Because when you look back, you expect to see something, a clear indication that something was wrong. But then, there isn't one. Investigators would later piece together those final hours. A chain of events that connected one moment to the next. And at the center of that sequence was a presence that couldn't be ignored. Jodi was there. She wasn't distant from what happened. She was part of the timeline. And once someone becomes part of the timeline, the questions change. It's no longer what happened. It becomes what happened while you were there. When investigators first spoke to her, there was no panic, no hesitation. Jodi Arias was calm, controlled. She didn't rush her words. She spoke clearly, as if everything she was saying was simple, straightforward. And that kind of composure can be convincing. She said she hadn't been there. She hadn't seen Travis. She didn't know what had happened. And in that moment, there was no direct evidence to challenge that. So the statement stood. Investigators continued their work, examining the scene, looking at details others might overlook. And that's when they found something that didn't fit the narrative she had given. A camera, damaged, left behind. At first glance, it didn't seem critical. When they recovered the memory, they weren't just looking at images. They were looking at time, sequence, proof. Photos taken on the same day everything happened. Clear, undeniable. And in those images, there was no question. Jodi was there. Now the calmness, the composure, the certainty of that first statement had to be reconsidered. Because if she wasn't there, how did she appear in those images? And if she was there, why say she wasn't? That's when the focus shifted, from the crime itself to the story being told about it. Jodi was there, not just in passing, not just briefly. She was present, inside the house, with Travis, and that meant one thing. Her first story was no longer possible, but the images revealed something else too. Because as the timeline progressed, the tone of the images shifted. The normal moments gave way to something different, something that suggested movement. The camera didn't just capture presence, it captured a sequence. And sequence tells a story, through moments that follow one another without interruption. And that kind of evidence doesn't change, which meant that no matter what was said next, the timeline would remain, unmoved, unchanged, waiting to be explained. When the evidence was presented, the shift was immediate. Now she remembered being there. But what happened next was no longer about denial. It was about explanation. And the explanation she gave introduced something new, something unexpected. She described intruders, two individuals, entering the home, uninvited, dangerous, violent. She said the situation escalated quickly, that she reacted out of fear. She wasn't responsible. She was a witness, a victim of circumstance, someone who had barely escaped. And at first, that kind of story can create doubt. It suggests that something more complicated might have happened, that maybe there were factors that hadn't been considered yet. But investigators don't rely on possibility, they rely on consistency. And consistency is measured against evidence. And slowly, that version began to break. Because when a story is tested against reality, it either holds or it doesn't. And this one didn't. There were too many gaps. The explanation didn't match the environment, which raised another question. If the second version wasn't accurate, why create it? However, the context changed. Now it was self-defense. She described fear, threat, a situation where she felt she had no control, a moment where everything escalated beyond reason, where her actions were not planned but reactive. And this version carried something different, because self-defense introduces justification. It places it within a context that suggests survival, response to danger, and that makes it more complex. Because now, it's not just about what happened, it's about why it happened. But again, the same process was applied: consistency with evidence, alignment with the timeline, compatibility with the physical scene. And once again, questions emerged. And slowly, this version too began to weaken. Not because it was impossible, but because it didn't align. It didn't fit cleanly with what had already been established. And when three versions exist, each one different from the last, the focus shifts away from the stories themselves and toward the pattern, because the pattern becomes the story. Version 1, not there. Version 2, intruders. Version 3, self-defense. 3 explanations, each introduced after something new was revealed, each replacing the last. And that sequence created its own narrative. The courtroom changed everything. What had been private was now public. Every detail, every statement, every contradiction, presented openly, observed closely. People didn't just watch for the outcome. They watched for understanding, for clarity, for something that would explain how everything had unfolded the way it did. And at the center of it all was Jodi, seated, composed, controlled. Her presence in the courtroom became part of the narrative. Not just what she said, but how she appeared, how she responded, how she carried herself under pressure. Because in a case like this, behavior matters, and perception influences how people interpret what they see. She spoke, answered questions, explained her versions, maintained her tone, and for some, that composure raised questions. For others, it reinforced doubt, because reactions vary and people interpret behavior differently. But the courtroom wasn't built on interpretation. It was built on examination, on presenting facts, on placing statements against evidence and seeing what holds. And as the process unfolded, it became less about storytelling and more about alignment. What matched, what didn't, what remained consistent, and what changed. Cross-examination is where pressure builds, not through volume, not through intensity alone, but through focus, through repetition, through precision. Questions are asked, answers are given, then those answers are revisited, examined, compared, and slowly patterns begin to emerge. In this case, the focus returned again and again to one thing: the changes. Each version was brought forward, placed side by side, compared not just in content but in timing, when it was introduced, what had been revealed just before it, why it replaced the previous version. And under that level of attention, inconsistencies became more visible. The questions didn't need to be aggressive. They didn't need to be dramatic. They only needed to be consistent, because consistency exposes contrast, and contrast reveals difference, and difference in a situation like this raises doubt, not about what happened, but about how it was being explained. Beyond the facts, beyond the timeline, beyond the courtroom, there was another layer to consider, the psychological one. Because actions don't happen in isolation. They come from somewhere, from patterns, from emotional states, from ways of thinking that develop over time. This case wasn't just about a single moment. It was about a relationship, an imbalance that had been building gradually. Connection, attachment, distance, and the tension created between those elements. When one person moves forward and another struggles to let go, the space between them doesn't remain neutral. It becomes charged, filled with uncertainty, emotion, reaction, and in some cases, that emotional pressure can distort perception. It can change how situations are interpreted, how actions are justified. And that's what makes cases like this difficult to reduce to a single explanation. Because human behavior isn't simple, influenced by factors that aren't always visible on the surface, which means that even when the outcome is clear, the underlying reasons can remain complicated. After everything had been presented, after every version had been examined, after every piece of evidence had been placed into context, the jury reached a decision: guilty. It wasn't delivered with drama. It wasn't unexpected, but it carried weight, because it marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the conversation surrounding the case didn't stop, because verdicts answer legal questions. They determine responsibility. They establish an outcome, but they don't always resolve uncertainty. And in cases like this, where narratives shift, where psychology plays a role, where emotion and evidence intersect, there are always questions that remain, not about what the court decided, but about how everything came together to reach that point. And through it all, one thing remained constant: the evidence. It didn't change. And that contrast between what stayed the same and what kept changing became the story. Because sometimes the most important detail in a case isn't what people say, it's what doesn't move, what doesn't shift, what remains fixed no matter how many times the story changes. Final pause. She told 3 different versions, 3 ways to understand what happened. But in the end, only one version remained aligned with everything else, and that's the one that mattered. She will now spend the rest of her days in federal prison, in confinement, locked away from the sane world. Jodi never apologized to the family of Travis Alexander. Drop your comments if you think she is justified for what she did. Hit the subscribe button for more to come. See you soon.